Good evening. I'm Laura Sillerman, a member of the Board of Trustees here at the American Museum of Natural History, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this opportunity to be among greatness. Greatness as it is represented by the example of Theodore Roosevelt and by his father's vision as a founder of this museum. Greatness as it is embodied by the ongoing dedication of everyone connected to the museum to inspire, to educate, to inquire, and to lead. Greatness of a scale with our 32 million artifacts, thousands of expeditions, and outreach to millions of school children worldwide. And greatness of resourcefulness. For these walls represent the family destination that is second only to the 2 Disney extravaganzas of acreage in attendance in this country. Of course, greatness cannot be quantified, just as love cannot be measured. Yes, we speak of love tonight because you will see it is all about that. For what is nature's greatest mystery but the love it inspires in humans? And what is poetry but an ongoing dialogue between the mind and the heart? Tonight represents the first collaboration between the museum and Poet's House, the national 50,000-volume poetry library, literary center, and exhibition space right here in Manhattan. Like the museum, Poet's House is a locus of sacred faith in humanity. And now, here is Lee Brussetti, its executive director.
Comments and for being a natural bridge between Poet's House and the American Museum of Natural History. And thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to listen and think together with all of you and these 2 brilliant writers who care passionately about life on Earth. And in this place, one of the great centers of discovery and affiliation in the material world. We don't know exactly where the conversation will go, but we suspect that given how much these marvelous thinkers have already given us, we'll journey through the various overlapping habitats of imagination, conservation, evolution, and articulation. And that's what I call a great hike. E.O. Wilson has called Homo sapiens the poetic species because our cognitive infrastructure is so dependent on analogy and metaphor. So, of course, as the longtime director of Poet's House, which makes a place for the poetic species to encounter, well, poetry, this interests me very much. And certainly one of the possibilities for inquiry tonight seems to me to have to do with considering the proximity between the language of science and literature. How are they both rooted in observation and articulation? What is the promise of Consilience? Although our conversation starts in the pleasure of this company, we have many urgent questions. Human behavior is changing the living world. We have come to a moment of environmental crisis that has profound implications for the future of our own species and for the planet we share with other forms of life. Both E.O. Wilson and Robert Hass are deeply concerned about human impacts on biodiversity. Both have called for, and in some instances established, educational programs that join emotion with rational analysis to create a deeper and more enduring conservation ethic. This also interests us very much. Even before this event took shape, Poets House was deeply engaged in a project entitled The Language of Conservation in 6 zoos throughout the country, placing poems throughout the zoos to test whether or not the poetic species might be engaged in deeper affiliations with other living creatures through poetry. Millions of people throughout the country encounter these poems in zoos. In exit interviews, we have learned that people could remember lines of poetry after seeing them, and that their conservation IQ actually seemed to be raised. But they often did not know that what they liked was poetry. This confirmed what Poets House had learned through our work with public librarians. When people experience poetry, they are often surprised and delighted. But if you tell them it's coming, they get nervous. And this is another thing that poetry and the sciences often share in our culture. The general public responds to both disciplines with some suspicion, nervous about being invited in, though the practitioners are passionate about what they do. And so, this is an important as well as celebratory conversation. Many joint energies have created this cooperative public space that invites generative thinking. I want to thank Poets House friend Nancy Heckinger, who introduced us to Lisa Guggenheim, Senior VP here at the museum, and Bella Desai, Director of Public Programs. We thank them sincerely, as well as Suzanne Morris, Assistant Director of Public Programs, and Ellen Evaristo, the museum's Senior Publicist. And of course, Ellen Futter, President of the museum. Again, thank you all for being here, and I hope that this event will activate your inner naturalist and poet, and that you'll trek down to the west shore of the Hudson in lower Manhattan as well to visit Poets House. The great Sufi poet Rumi has written, "Let the beauty we love be what we do." Thank you, Robert Hass and E.O. Wilson, for the work that invites us in to share more of the beautiful information and the news of the universe. Thank you.
If you're not good, Dr. Wilson's going to leave. Dr. Robert Hass is Distinguished Professor of Poetry and Poetics at the University of California at Berkeley and has held the position of U.S. Poet Laureate from 1995 to 1997. Here's what Stanley Kunitz, one of the founders of Poets House, once wrote about him. Reading a poem by Robert Hass is like stepping into the ocean when the temperature of the water is not much different from that of the air. You scarcely know until you feel the undertow tug at you that you have entered into another element. For Dr. Hass, everything is connected. Literacy, ecology, the infinity of language, and activism. As Poet Laureate, he organized a 6-day conference at the Library of Congress that brought together American nature writers to celebrate writing, the natural world, and community. Dr. Hass is known not only as a poet, but as a translator and a crusader for literacy, for justice, and for the environment. He's published many books of poetry, including Field Guide, Praise, Human Wishes, and Sun Under Wood. His 2007 poetry collection, Time and Materials, won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. He also received a MacArthur Genius Fellowship in 1984. He has recently published a book of essays titled What Light Can Do, Essays on Art, Imagination, and the Natural World. He'll be signing copies after tonight's program. Dr. Edward O. Wilson, an American biologist, researcher, theorist, naturalist, author, and professor emeritus in the Department of Organismic and Environmental Biology at Harvard. I was so afraid I pronounced it. He is also an honorary board member of this museum and a member of the advisory council for the museum's Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. His biological specialty is myrmecology, the study of ants, on which he is considered to be the world's leading authority. The museum hosts a collection of over 16 million insects and bugs, and we are very fond of entomologists here. But more than being awed by his work in that discipline, so many of the scientists at this museum have been inspired by his phenomenal writings on the wealth of the natural world. In fact, much of the design and spirit of the Hall of Biodiversity in this museum owes its inspiration to Dr. Wilson's work, especially his New York Times bestsellers, The Social Conquest of Earth, Ant Hill, a novel, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning On Human Nature. He also recently published The Social Conquest of the Earth, which he will be signing after the program. And now I present these two giants to you.
Robert, I'll seize the initiative in order to pass the ball quickly to you. You know, you're a master at the domain of human thought and creativity, the one that we scientists are fearful of, that we will never be able to analyze and understand.
Well, I think what she was afraid of saying is that you, by a slip of the tongue, is that you held a professorship in orgasmic biology. And somewhere in that territory, the two disciplines meet. I've been studying for a couple of weeks the social conquest of the earth, and I knew that we were going to have this discussion. And the first question I was thought to ask you was, how do you always manage to get in so much trouble?
Good scientists, like good corporate innovators, are entrepreneurial, and they're the ones that are most likely to get into trouble. And I've always enjoyed being in trouble. I got into a lot in the 1970s when I dared to propose in the book Sociobiology that there is such a thing as human nature. Many of you in the audience are too young to remember that there was a time that the social scientists, as well as the American left, believed that there was no such thing as human nature, and that there was no such thing as a genetic influence in human behavior or any such thing as instinct. And in proposing that, I got into a lot of trouble. I once had to be escorted by police into the rear of the Science Center at Harvard because there was a great mob out front for my talk there. And there was a big mob out front calling for my head. Well, not my head, there was just a discharge me from Harvard. and others were, had protests held in Harvard Square calling for my dismissal from Harvard for such a dangerous and outrageous idea. So yeah, I've been there. Now I'm bragging about how much I've been pilloried, and I bet you can't match that.
No, I can't.
But anyway, yeah.
No, I'm not going to. I was going to brag about getting beaten up by police at the demonstration, but I'm not. It doesn't count.
You weren't at Berkeley during the trouble there.
But the interesting thing in the part of this conversation about science and the humanities is it's still the case in the humanities, in the kids who are being educated now by the young generation of scholars, that there is a deep suspicion of the idea that there's any fundamental human nature. And it's sort of worth saying that there are very good reasons historically for that suspicion. That is, in my territory, the idea was that in the Enlightenment and the Romantic period, there was this appeal made to nature against all the artifice and convention of a world run by a kind of Louis XIV view of things. And that by the middle of the 19th century, people like Marx were saying that while the idea of nature was once liberating, the bourgeoisie had taken it over to put women in their place, to say that homosexuality was perversion, to say that a monotheist God was the natural order, et cetera, so that the reasons for suspicion of nature culturally have, in ways that we have already talked about, bled over into ways we talked about biologically.
Yeah, it's always been a tough road for the biologist. You're right, the Enlightenment died in the early 1800s. It died because the enthusiasts, many of whom were scientists, the very earliest scientists, didn't even call it science in those days, were not able to deliver. And of course, the Romantic movement took over. And then when something resembling the Enlightenment began to come back in the 20th century, it came back in rather, how shall I put it, friable and easily distorted form, and that was that humans really are, their behavior, their abilities really are genetically determined, and from that came the birth of eugenics, as you well know. And from eugenics came not just fascist version, but also the Soviet Union for the first 10 years of its existence had institutions of eugenics designed to create the perfect socialist man. So we saw the disaster that brought out. And the social scientists themselves wanted to distance themselves, particularly through the influence of Franz Boas. Was Boas an American museum man? Well, I shouldn't. He's one of the great anthropologists of all time. But he was set pretty much in the view that culture was everything.
Yeah.
And so the social sciences under the Boasian, partly under the Boasian worldview, passed on to stellar figures like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. The social sciences settled upon a no instinct view, and that's what I and a few others came up against in the 1970s.
You immediately, upon the publication of sociobiology, got accused of being determinist, eugenicist.
Keep going.
I think I'll
That's
stop.
the reason.
I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's the reason for my tenuous position at Harvard during the 1970s. Even at Harvard. Well, now sociobiology is a pretty well-established discipline, and we've come to accept that we have an instinct, but we have a vastly more sophisticated view now, and I think we are tempered a bit and moderated by the understanding of the terrible historical consequences of the misuse of that worldview in past generations.
One of the amazing things, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read this remarkable book yet of the social conquest. It seems like sociobiology of human nature, Consilience, that you are still working very hard at putting these ideas together. And it seemed to me the core of your argument about this, in this book, was about two competing views of the nature of the evolution of social behaviors. Could you Could you talk about that a bit?
You may be referring to a controversy that's been raging among the evolutionary biologists for the past 2 years. And that was due to a bombshell type article that two mathematicians at Harvard and I published in Nature, a leading journal. And it brought clearly to focus that there are two radically different views of where social behavior and altruism come from. The prevailing worldview was that it was kinship and a automatic and inherited devotion to the welfare of kin to a degree that fell away with a degree of kinship, so that you would expect in animals, at least insects and animals, for advanced social behavior, which it is, to be most likely to occur wherever groups of very close relatives came together. And that seemed to actually work pretty well. But it was beginning to fray at the edges, that particular theory. And then two mathematicians at Harvard, Martin Novak and Karina Tarnita and I, and they are mathematicians of the first rank because they had to be in order to solve the problem, found that the basic theorem of the old view of kinship, kin selection, really it's called, was mathematically unsound because of something called the Hamilton inequality. Don't press me about it, okay? The Hamilton inequality at the foundation, and it took a tremendous amount of work that had never been done, analytic work, to get to that foundation, was unsound, it didn't work. And by that time, a lot of new evidence is coming in that it didn't apply very well as we thought. So a new paradigm came into prominence. It wasn't new, but we brought it into prominence, called multi-level selection. That altruism arises by the superimposition or the coexistence with ordinary Darwinian selection, natural selection called evolution, in addition to individual versus individual competition, that there's group selection, group against group. And we could show, and others showed, that that would be enough to drive species into advanced social behavior with a lot of altruism. So, at the present time, we are, and I'm totally absorbed in writing the latest paper on this, we were facing two paradigms radically different, two theories, and which would prove to be the correct one. This is something that happens once in a while in science. The paradigm is a whole world view of what's going on. It's not just a theory about known processes and how they might interact in a new and added, a new entity or process added and make the whole thing more understandable. There are two radically different world views on a very important subject, social behavior and altruism. And here they were, side by side, here they still are. It's not going to be like physics with the simultaneously existing in both correct paradigm, wave and particle, explanation of matter. One has got to win. If one is correct, the other is wrong. And I'll stop right there by leaving it to the delectation of the potential readers here gathered.
One thing that's really interesting about this idea that on the one hand, let me just trace out this argument a bit. As in the chapters of the book as it proceeds, in order to get the human brain large enough to be really good at throwing spears and eventually developing language out of the birth canal, you have this prematurely born mammal child that requires years of very close attention. So the other evolutionary thing that has to occur is the female has to evolve out of an estrus cycle into a state of constant sexual interest and availability in order to secure a family unit which can protect this helpless being. Is that right so far?
Well spoken.
So then the core evolutionary object is first of all the family, and secondly the larger social group, and the need to develop social behaviors in order to protect the ongoing life of the group is one powerful evolutionary impulse.
I believe that it's true, and what you've done is actually hit upon it's not newer, but let's say the theory in which I've been involved that is newly arisen from us. Exactly, that the way the human brain evolved, it started evolving up to the present level a scant 3 million years ago. And it went from 400 to 500 cubic centimeters to 15 in that short period of time. That's a short period of time of evolution. And in order for it to get up that high, because it was, it had tremendous advantage over all the rest of life on Earth when it got that high, there had to be some very special processes going on. You just described one of them very nicely, of how the human being had to change. Our life cycle had to change. And out of that comes the idea or I should say almost compelling consequence, that there had to be something like group selection. There had to be heavy emphasis upon not only the family, you could call that kin selection, but it's bigger than that, but on the society and the group, how well it functions as a group. And of course, in group versus group competition, what you expect to see is throughout history, as soon as it had to be recorded. So that it would be rather violent, with a lot of conflict.
So in my reading of that, in any individual member of this thing, there is also the ordinary impulse of not only mammals but all living organisms to selfishly produce and reproduce its own seed no matter what.
That's true, but also increasingly we're seeing.
So there's the selfish gene notion on the one hand, and there's the absolute necessity of group selection, altruism on the other.
Correct, sir. And this is one reason I've argued that we are constantly conflicted. It's our basic nature to be conflicted. There is no equilibrium between the consequences of group selection favoring altruism, group cooperative behavior, selfish behavior within the group, trying to get the best we can within the group. And may I suggest that we've now come up to the borders of the humanities?
Well, we come to the place where the dance of the tension between these two things constitutes the experience of having choice and free will and moral life in individual human beings and in the species.
Do you think, we can gabble on forever as scientists about this subject and gather data sets, and maybe one paradigm, I know one paradigm will prevail over the other, and soon, in time, we will have a pretty well-knit scientific body of scientific thinking about this subject. But what does it mean for the humanities, if anything? Well, that's a tough question. Since you just told me about my field, probably I'm supposed to try to tell you about your field.
This is interesting in a couple of ways. One is that I teach with a friend who's a geochemist and a hydrologist, an introductory environmental studies class for large groups of Berkeley freshmen. And the first two pieces of reading we give them are John Muir's account, which Teddy Roosevelt, who's sponsoring this evening, read, of a moment when, in the middle of the prediction of a really terrible Sierra storm, he climbed up into the highest lodgepole tiny he could find and strapped himself in so he could enjoy the storm and conduct it like a Beethoven symphony. And he uses the occasion of this essay to say that's why this idea that Darwin's proposals are survival of the fittest and cruel rather than the glorious experience of the love lavished on the planet by these great suns that go through improving the strength of the forest. So there's this ecstatic, that's delicious essay. And then we give them to read an essay by Joe Didion about how people in LA feel when the Santa Ana winds blow. One of the first things that happens is that homicide rate, especially among married couples, goes up about 400% every time the rain comes through. So you get this one LA noir view of us as totally determined beings, just Pavlovian response to the weather, and this other incredible celebration of nature. And those two conceptual forms, I've come to realize, really have characterized paradigms of biology in thinking about human beings. That is the clemence of the original ideas of the American ecologists, which was that once they started studying the interrelationships among species, that there was the interactions between them were so rich, it made sense to talk about a pond or a dune system as a superorganism. This was, I guess, in the 1910s during the Progressive Era, and then 10 years later, someone else is publishing an essay in the middle of the Coolidge administration saying, nonsense. And I think the essay is called The Individualistic Conception of Plant Associations. It's that nature is ruthless competition among species, and the idea that there's any kind of cooperative interaction is a false paradigm. So it seems like this argument between the selfish gene and the altruistic gene has gone on at every level of thinking about nature.
But the fact that conceptions or paradigms of thinking about them based upon one of the influence on one of the other does not mean that they do not exist. What it means in effect that probably what they are is an authentic conflict. And the whole process of the evolution led to the brain and manifested in the humanities. If the humanities, I'll be daring here, could be thought of as the natural history of human behavior delivered in exquisite detail over and over again in countless situations. And the permutations are countless, all these human relationships as they develop in special circumstances somehow are obedient to the most basic principles of human nature, because that's what we call great literature, I suppose, is when you produce a tableau of relationships and a story that reflects not just the particular of a place and time, but something that's true for general humanity. If that's the natural history of human behavior, will literary studies ever try to go beyond that? I mean, are you in danger of becoming more too biological, or what? What's going on?
This is an interesting.
Yeah, I didn't think of that until right now.
There are later in the book there's a chapter on the evolutionary origin of culture, and then on the evolutionary origin of the arts, and what their adaptive value was, which would tell us about something about what we do when we listen to stories or listen to music, or will tell me something what I would do when I try to make poems. And the territory in which this is completely comfortable discourse in the humanities is the idea that it's the tension between these two notions, and that the human species is on the one hand stuck in, and on the other hand enlivened, made what it is by that dynamic. So I think in the same period when Teddy Roosevelt was starting the national park system and these two competing views of ecology, the individualistic and the kind of socialistic conception of ecosystems, I think the word ecosystem wasn't invented until the 40s or 50s or something like that. Were in here. So the poets were struggling with this. Robert Frost has a very dire view of nature, of the darkness of it, though he posed as a genial poet. And another poet like Wallace Stevens thought that it was basically unknowable, but humans would learn everything they could learn about order and beauty from it, without ever knowing what it is. I remember the first time you and I had a conversation in public, you said, every species lives in its own sensory world. And that allowed in the modern American poet, this sense of absolute mystery at the core of our being here, of not knowing that we would ever know exactly what birds' experience is, or what ants' experience is, or what that we move among great powers and mysteries, and that old idea that we move among great powers and mysteries was at the core of what we glimpse of the origin of imagination and culture, of a kind of polytheism of amazing powers. So at some level I feel like, and I felt this the first time I ever went into one of the tombs in Cairo and saw these 3,000-year-old carvings of birds and fish absolutely accurately rendered. The smallest little hump on the hooded crow's back, which is unlike any American crow, all of it rendered in absolute detail. I thought humans have been paying attention to these things and feeling them as powers from the beginning. And so in some way, while science is progressing, the imaginative arts have always been pretty much in the same place, with the same kind of knowledge and the same pull back and forth between these two ways of seeing.
It's so interesting what you're saying. In that, as biology progresses, what it seems to be doing is to revealing the roots of ambiguities that are for maybe forever with us. For example, we were just talking about the eternal confliction of the human mind. It's tied up also with free will and the origin around it. Confliction between the service to the group versus the service of the individual, and it's not capable of equilibrium. You went too far, say, to individualism, the society would dissolve. If you went too far toward obedience to the group, and full attention to all of the needs of the group, you would be an ant colony. So we're conflicted and we're moving back and forth. But then now you brought up something completely different, which is similar innate ambiguity. I talked about from the point of view of biology. If we are as group besotted, group faithful, besotted with our group, the triumphant of our group, the intense need to belong to groups, identify with them, to see them as superior, all of that. Since that seems to be the case, we're beginning to understand a little bit of the source of religious fervor. But that combined with the need to explain the nature of the world, as you say, we go back 30,000 years ago or more in art, and gradually humans tried to capture what these things were. Then we have another reason for understanding a great ambiguity in the human mind between what you referred to as the powers. What rules us? What is the unknown? And is there an unknowable? And how should we pay obeisance to it or express sufficient awe to it? And what the scientists, how shall I say it, the excessively naturalistic scientist want to think that eventually we'll understand it all and somehow that might vaporize. That's another ambiguity that seems to me expressed very well in letters as well.
Yeah. There are two things in the book that are very, or so many things, but two that are very striking. And one of them is the long thought that you have had about the relationship between the evolutionary power of the group and tribalism and religion and war. That there's the really dangerous and dark side of our altruistic and cooperative is that it always is creating an us against a bad them that leads to the incessant and endless violence in human history. I don't know what we can say to that, but I won't. And then the other part is the end of the book. The last chapters are called A New Enlightenment, and that seems to imply a hope that in relation to the kinds of mystification of power that are involved in tribalism and certain kinds of organized religion, that we need to do the work of disenchantment that science does. And the interesting thing about this is that there's a familiar discourse among environmentalists and humanities, which is that science, by objectifying the natural world, has killed the spirit in it and allowed industrial civilization to manipulate it at their will.
There's a lot to that as well, for sure.
And there's a younger group of environmental and cultural historians who have been arguing, on the contrary, the old world's habit of seeing animals immediately turned them into metaphors for human things. Lions are pride, snakes are this, and in the 17th century, with the development of empirical science, people started saying, how does it feel to be an ant? What would it be like to be a spider? That on the contrary, the sciences began to look with an earnest eye at how other creatures than humans made their living and did see them as symbols of human attitudes and conditions.
One thing biology has brought us is an idea of what the Germans call the Umwelt, the sensory world around us, and how peculiar the human mind is. We think we see everything, but we only see a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. And we see four colors, but that's the way the optical cortex is organized, and the sensory intermediate neuron organized frequency, impulse, coding of frequency coming back from the retina. Well, other animals see red, infrared that we can't see, and our ultraviolet we can't see. And then even more, we only hear a tiny sliver of the frequencies that animals are using all the time. If you go out in the rainforest, as I did recently in Africa, and you turn on frequency receptors that go up to 40,000 cycles, you can actually hear dozens of species of katydids singing that you didn't know were there, and so on and on. So these creatures, ants, all of them, mostly living incidentally by smell and taste. That's what they sense best, superbly well. It's an entirely different universe from the one we live in century. I don't know what you'll make of that. I mean, maybe the novelists, interpreters under your aegis will tell us what the real life of an ant would be, or a katydid, or a wolf. That's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
But if I may, I want to be careful with our time. Segue into something you brought up that's so important, where I think you and I are on the same side, and that's a disturbing trend since we're dealing with conservation. We're dealing here with the temple of Theodore Roosevelt, and the fountainhead of so much of biology and activism and knowledge that led to the modern American conservation movement. This is a disturbing trend. that is, they're conservationists, labeled, self-labeled as that, who sort of think we ought to give up on the idea of wildernesses, that's just in the head, that somehow we should stop worrying about reserves and be thinking about mingling nature and humanity together in some sort of a glorious garden and save biodiversity that way. I'm frightened by this. And it's gotten serious talk among some conservation scientists. Is that your perception that there's a risk here?
Yeah, I mean, I think this connects to our other conversation in the way, one of the ways in which the science, especially the sciences you practice it, and the evolution of literature, but particularly poetry, has been to try to history has given us to contemplate the richness of the gene pool we came from and what's happening to it. And both kinds of imagination have turned to that subject, sometimes in terrible ways. Postmodern poets are writing about how little there is left. Scientists are having meetings with titles like, which species can we still save? At this moment, there is not in the world that's still just trying to defend oil subsidies, but in the community of artists and scientists, beyond a condition beyond alarm. And in my part of the world, what I'm aware of is, at one level, people have tried to find hope by giving up. And the way of giving up has been to say, nature's over. This is not to attack Bill McKibben's wonderful book, but the hypothesis of that book is, if, to the extent that we meant by nature world processes untouched by human beings, between acid rain and global warming, there's nothing left untouched by human beings. Nature is over. We have become what the myth said we were, in charge of the garden of the world. And, which is true enough.
That's chillingly accurate.
Yeah.
And I'm actually hearing this from people that are, pretty well educated.
And the next part of the argument that I hear is that because it's a garden, we might as well give up on the idea of wilderness preservation, because wilderness is, after all, a cultural concept. It's selling rainforest ice cream to people in cities as propaganda to take away land from peasants who want to cut down trees and start raising cattle and making money in the rainforest.
That gives me an opportunity to confess I am an extremist. I believe there are wildernesses. I've been there. I believe. I think that in reference to the species that we might still save, and half of them are endangered by the end of the century if we don't take some action, that we need parks, big ones, lots of them. I think we should be thinking about giving a large part of the world's surface to wildland. What are we doing when you do that? What you're doing is taking care, not just being a conservationist, not just saving species. You are holding on to the rest of life. I'm sometimes asked, or it comes up in conversation with students and others, we may have to have a triage. There's certain species that are just so endangered, and then areas that are being encroached on, natural areas that we'll have to, just in the interest of the economy, the realities of the economy and the needs of the people around them, we have to let them go, and some will be in the category of, well, they deserve our attention, we're going to try to save them. And I have a doctrine, save them all. And that's what I'm going to be writing on. I'm spending, actually, it's time for me to run for governorship. No, I didn't mean to make a political statement, but I mean it. I have a few years left, I hope I do, and I'm spending them.
Talk about that. Talk about that, would you?
Well, I'm spending them on national parks. I'm working right now in my hometown of Mobile, Alabama. You can't tell that from the way I talk, can you? Working with a group that's now become very strong, we have traction, we have the agreement of the congressional delegation, and we think we can do it. We're going to create a major national park at Mobile. It will consist of a wilderness, the second largest delta in America, Mobile Delta, and the Red Hills deeply dissected with northern affiliated plants and animals in the deep, cool interior. And we can create a park. We know we can do it, and we have friendly signals from the national park system. I'm also working, forgive this, this presentation of Vita. I am not applying for a job at AMNH. Incidentally, you can tell a true devotee among scientists, including taxonomists and others, who so look up to the American Museum of Natural History. The way they say AMNH, we say, the real pros say AMNH. Anyway, where was I? There is a movement developing within the park system and among friends of it, the national park system of the U.S., to make all our national parks centers of research and education. And what better way to introduce young people, especially to science and through nature. So that's one movement. I've also been traveling around the world, looking at national parks in Africa and other places to see how they're doing. I really do think that we should have, and I'm pleased to seize this opportunity, and forgive me for making it somewhat polemical, to say I think we need a renewal of the Rooseveltian spirit of creating and holding on fast in national parks around the world.
I also just think as a tactical matter, that people who care about these things should not always be in the position of defending against the next development. There's always the catcher, or it's always a defensive position that just is much more powerful thing to be proactive in creating new places for.
You're quite right
I
about
have
that.
a metaphor for this, which and it's also a fact, which is lovely when those things happen, and terrible in this case because I got to visit the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea recently. It's about 3 miles wide and it runs from one end of the peninsula to the other. And it's the most militarized piece of real estate on the earth. And there are, as you know, 8 species of Asian cranes. All of them are either endangered or nearly endangered. And 2 of them are making a comeback because they do their winter foraging in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, which has been made into an unintentional national park. And if North and South Korea ever settle their problems and remove the last nuclear tripwire of the Cold War, that land will probably be developed, and those 2 species, which are 10 million years old, will be gone from the kinds on Earth.
Wouldn't that be a wonderful development? I've been associated with the Koreans and Korean Americans since the beginning of that for the peace part of the DMZ. And some North Koreans actually have very quietly expressed interest in it.
Yeah.
It would have a lot of commercial value, economic value for both Koreans. And you're quite right. They're the leverage of return.
And the other part is thinking about what you folks have just been through, the experience of the last storm. I think about the Hudson River and East River, and you're part of the Atlantic Ocean. and how, following the work you do, we educate our kids so that they become stewards of those places, that they have the poetry and they have the science in their heads to become stewards of biologically alive rivers in a place made safe to the world as we're reconstructing it with art.
You know, you just said something that's profoundly important, and that is that, and I feel comfortable saying it in this group, you know, because of the ambiance of the AMH in terms of conservation, is that we've been on the defensive too long. You know, I've countless times when I've had it asked me in serious surroundings, well, what good is biodiversity? I mean, you know, why should we keep all these species? And then I find myself like a prisoner on a dock, reciting, you know, all the reasons why I think biodiversity is important, and it's just dispiriting. I think if we could now take the offensive in many ways, you know, through, because this is important, you know, this is saving the rest of life, this is saving the habitat and the world in which our species was born, with all those true peculiarities you were just mentioning. And I think we ought to get very positive about it. Yeah. Teddy, where are you when we need you?
One kind of work like that is really education, and in the way that you describe our social evolution and the way that storytelling, these are subjects I know we're not going to get to, but I'm talking about the evolution of language and evolution of music and the evolution of dance being part of this, of the altruist communitarian side of our genetic inheritance, that people learn to sway together, sing together, tell certain kind of stories that they share. If our kids are not being told those stories, the children of New York are not wandering through here and seeing those North American mammals and feeling some kind of wonder in their presence. If they don't know the names of the trees in Central Park, how are they going to be stewards and caretakers of them?
Do you foresee in literature, letters, fiction, especially, the possibility of more of an infusion, not necessarily of science, because they're figuring out, you know, the properties of the Higgs boson, for God's sake, but the infusion into letters of more and more biological knowledge, and particularly having to do with something I'm most concerned about, which is, you know, the property of the rest of life, you know, of nature, real nature.
Yeah.
You see any trend or any prospect for that? More than exists today?
I think we have to work at it.
I agree.
For sure.
Yeah.
I got asked to go to my granddaughter's kindergarten class to talk about poetry. And I didn't know if I would know how to do it, but I brought the book I had with me, which was the poems of Elizabeth Bishop. And there's a poem of hers called The Fish. And it begins, I caught a tremendous fish. So I opened the book and I said to these little kids, just say this poem with me, okay? I caught a tremendous fish. And this group of kids all on the floor looked up at me and said, I caught a tremendous fish. And I said, it was very old and its skin. And they said, it was very old and its skin. And I said, looked like roses in old wallpaper. And they said, ooh. And I thought, you got it. And I thought, this is a cinch. And then one kid raised his hand and said, and I said, yes, what's your name? And he said, Rodney. And I said, yes, Rodney. And he said, I have to go to the bathroom. But I thought education was not so easy.
Oh, but you know, what you were doing, you were telling a story in the old style.
Yeah. So, so what stories we tell?
That's what we have to work on together. Is, you know, stories. that it isn't, education shouldn't be a matter of saying, okay, kids, listen up. Here's what you've got to know about elementary biology and so on and so on. Here's the basic facts, terms you need to know, and show them an interesting film of it. It's somehow got to be made into a story. I don't know exactly how to do that, but maybe that's where the humanities can have a powerful new role.
Yeah, as they work out inside this imagination of how we feel that the world is going to kill us and gives us life.
Yeah.
So,
Colonize science.
yeah. So I recommend this book to you because it
Yeah.
tracks through all of these issues. I think it's time to say thank you to you and to see if the audience has
Okay,
questions.
are we getting a signal that?
So my name is Bella Desai. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the museum at AIM&H. And I would encourage all of you that have questions to come up. We'll have about 15 minutes or so. So please walk on up to the mic stands in the front if you have questions. We're happy to take them. And I'll kick us off by asking about nature as a point of inspiration, because I think clearly through this conversation, we've heard that nature has inspired each of you, but to very different disciplines. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you were first inspired by nature to do what you do.
How the inspiration of nature affected the work you do and what you are. How the inspiration of nature affected the work you do and who you are.
Well, a simple way of putting it is, every kid has a bug period, and I never grew out of mine. When I was about 8 or 9, I was fascinated with insects and, nature and just the way so many kids are. And I was living in a beautiful area of the South, Panhandle, Florida, around Mobile, and I had access to woods, and I was an only kid, and I got out a lot. And I just decided that this is what I wanted to do the rest of my life, is be outdoors. It was the Boy Scouts of America. Please hold your crowns and so on. Look at this gay business straightened out. But it was the Boy Scouts of America that gave me my education. Thank you. And that, they legitimized outdoors living and natural history for me. And by the time I got to college, I found it wonderful that I might be able to do this the rest of my life. So I was directed down that channel. I don't think you can direct every kid so strictly down that channel, but I am certain of one thing, and that is that natural history and exposure to the outdoors, particularly allowing a kid to go out, maybe two together, to go out and explore on their own and find out things on their own, is a tremendously powerful way to get kids interested in one, nature, and possibly even science. Rachel Carson once said, let a child go to, take a child to the seashore, let the child go to a tide pool, give them a bucket, tell them to see what they could find. Don't tell them what to look for, and don't tell them what names are. Let them discover everything they can and bring a few things to you and talk with you about what they discovered. And I think that's the way to inaugurate science education, one way to inaugurate it. I was addressing you because I couldn't see you.
I don't remember ever not being interested in one of my earliest memories is of being taken to the doctor, and the doctor holding closed one of my nostrils and saying, "Now breathe hard," and a daisy popped out. And my mother said, "Did you stick that in your nose?" And I said, "I guess so." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "I guess to see what happened." So that's one level. And the other is, I remember when I was in high school, my older brother was in college, and he was taking a course in romantic poetry, and he turned to me, shared a room, and said, "Listen to this." And he read a few lines from Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, and the lines that I remember, still have in my head, are, "Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door." And I thought, oh my God, you could say that, you could see that, and then say that. So in a way, for me, poetry and the magic of language and the intimate magic of the natural world, which all little kids, city or country, know, is just there. It's not how we get it, it's how we lose it. That's the issue.
I wish you'd said more, or had a chance to say more about the magic of language. That's true.
About
the magic of language. The ability of language to infuse even simple objects, with power and, and magic and and meaning. That's what a poet does, isn't it?
It is, it's that ambition, and of course, the myth story is that it was given to Adam to name the creatures. The version, there's the great essay by Heidegger called "What is Poetry?" that says, language calls the world into being, and the way that I said that once I translated for years the poetry of Czesław Miłosz, who was not a fan of German philosophy, having lived under the German general government in World War II. And I said to him, well, Heidegger said, we call the world into being. And then I said, but of course he was a fascist. I said, exactly. We don't need anyone to flatter poets. But you're talking about this unit that got together of the family, the group, the tribe, to protect life, and in a very short time protect fire, I guess. Those two things. And then, in subsequence, found the rhythm that made dance, found the rhythm that made music, and found language, and said glass, water, table, and in that sense, called the world into being. The way we name it is in a given generation. Yes, what it is. It is magic.
So from the audience?
To what extent do you think that Hurricane Sandy will give you some chance to go on the offensive with the issue of climate control pushing things in your favor?
Again,
To what extent do you think Hurricane Sandy will give you the issue of climate control that will let you go on the offensive?
Believe it or not, I'm having trouble because of the resident. What was that?
Maybe you could ask.
I'll ask, is that question for you, sir?
No, do you think climate control is now a bigger issue because of Sandy and will help you to go on the offensive with your parks projects?
is climate control a bigger issue in the way that you approach your other conservation projects?
It's a big part, and that's one reason why, in a forthcoming book I have on national parks, particularly the Golden Globes of Alaska, I have a proposal in there that I know is being considered by an increasing number of people, the Wildlands Association, is an organization, to create continental, intercontinental corridors of wildland. I'd like to see North America box with a strip across Canada, and then one that's already been proposed in like Yukon, the Yellowstone, and then down the Rockies, and then one that we're working on out of Florida and Alabama at the present time that cross the Gulf. And another one that would be from from the Adirondacks to the Appalachian. These are practical corridors. They would add enormously to the amount of wildland available to save, the rest of life. And they would allow, I think, a lot of movement plants now during the climate change.
Because I think we're having a little trouble hearing, we're going to take just 2 more questions on the stage, and then we'll encourage you, both Dr. Hass and Dr. Wilson are going to be available for book signings outside, so if you have more questions, you can bring them out into the hall. So we'll just take these 2 more questions. Go ahead, sir.
I have a question, something that's not discussed about, maybe 15 years ago was a discussion, the one
A
before the
little
years.
closer to the microphone.
I like to talk about something that's very controversial. It's probably the most important thing of all, but it's hardly ever discussed. And I once saw a meeting of news media intellectuals, they were discussing it, and somebody mentioned it, specifically Gary Brown mentioned it. This is 15 years ago, and everybody just went hush. The thing that I think is the biggest thing that's hidden, and probably one of the biggest problems that we're facing, is overpopulation. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah. And of course, that's a root cause of many of our problems. But many of you will know that in every country, now this is not feminist propaganda, it's just the truth. Wherever women get control of their own economic lives, birth rates plummet. And birth rates are plummeting in every continent, well, at least declining even in Africa. And population estimates on that basis made by the United Nations and other experts believe that the world population will peak somewhere in the vicinity of 10 billion. That's about a 40% increase over what it is today. We can handle that. The big problem is not so much in population increase per se, but in per capita consumption. And that's the big thing we need to know.
It's worth saying twice. The most effective form of birth control on Earth is the education of women.
One last question, and then we'll go outside.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Actually-
say, you hear me better if I speak without the mic?
I can. Please.
That might be contributing to it, and I think people will be able to hear me. First of all, I want to just say, and then I want to save the audience some money. I remember your chat with that square of turf behind your house that you looked at.
Yeah.
Studied everything in it. And I saved a lot of money by giving kids magnifying glasses. I give them on the second year, the third year, the fourth year. When they say stop giving them to me, they're not using them, they keep them holding. But I think, and I was inspired by that. And you've really been a model for me in terms of your conservation. There was part of your speech that I found deeply disturbing, and we won't be able to go into it in detail. But you said Boaz believed that culture was everything. And I thought your description of the sort of evolution of thought over the 20th century had huge and bad gaps. Again, I really, I don't understand. And I wonder whether you believe we're told every day by many, many powerful people with voices magnified by billions that it is human nature that a relatively small group of people should rule over our society as they have all during recorded history, and that they should accumulate to themselves as much as they can to maintain that control. Now, the small group that is self-selected itself.
Gotta be a time.
I think we understand the question.
I think, well, actually, it's not a question. You were introduced to a very interesting topic. And may I address that, sir?
Part of human nature, that's what I'm
Yeah, well, I don't want to address that. I want to address the first part. Well, you suggested that you know what you were actually suggesting, if it fit in my case nicely, since I grew up in the middle of the city of Mobile, is that increasingly cities are finding ways to create what I like to call micro wildernesses or natural reserves right in the heart of the city. Vacant lots converted into reserves. Chicago has what it calls city wildernesses. And they've taken every vacant lot, every strip along the river and turned it into a reserve and let it come back as much as possible. And it takes kids especially out of school right into nature, sometimes just a few blocks away. And yes, what you were just innovating at first, give them a magnifying glass, let them work on a micro scale, and they'll get the idea. I think you have a speaker coming up. What's his name? About the hidden forest coming up. I think that's,
Yeah.
it's just enough. I forgot his name. He's
David
working in,
Haskell, David Haskell.
yeah.
David Haskell.
His book is extraordinarily interesting because this is the theme he develops beautifully. I think we can have, if we have more natural history conducted and taught that way, you could overcome at least some of the detriment that urban living imposes, disadvantage imposes on our children living in cities. Thank you for the suggestion.
I would say, to the other part of your question, does he think that dominance hierarchies are biologically inevitable? I just read this book. No, he doesn't think that. Anyway, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wilson and everyone.